Okay, since I'm from Montana, I thought we'd start with a picture from Montana. This is my dog Tristan on one of our favorite mountain hikes. Okay, well, let's get right to it. What we'll cover in today's presentation, our focus will be on pickup woven bands and how they were used in the old Norwegian farm society in the 1700s and 1800s. For everything from hair bands to sending bands to swaddling bands. We'll look at a couple of interesting bands from Vesterheim's collection, and we'll look at the interesting topic of woven in initials and dates in pickup bands. For those of you who have my Norwegian pickup band weaving book, I just want to let you know that most of the images you'll be seeing today are not in the book, so there'll be lots of new things to see. But the next image is one that is in the book. And if we could go to the next slide, I had asked Loran to help me put this together with a small trunk from Vesterheim's collection. And I wanted it to symbolize not only the voyage that these bands had taken to come to us, but I wanted it to look like a treasure spilling out of a treasure chest to represent the value that they have for us. And I love this image. It's also a good introduction to the use of color in Norwegian pickup band weaving, because as you'll see, we'll be seeing a lot of red today. Okay, so let's isolate one of those bands from the trunk. Now, we'll be seeing a lot of beautiful bands today, but before we get started, I'd like to show you how to tell the difference between the two different types of pickup that we'll see. And I know that a lot of you are not weavers, so we won't get into a lot of technical details, but what we will do is look very closely together at the next few photographs. And then I'll also show you how to tell the difference between pickup bands and the other types of woven bands that you'll see, other types of Norwegian bands. So when we look at a pickup band like this, what we're seeing are the lengthwise threads or the warp in the textile. The crosswise thread or weft is largely hidden behind a closely spaced warp. So here we're seeing the ends of the warp thread spill out at the bottom, and the fringe up above, we're seeing the red warp threads form those beautiful motifs. So how does this happen? Let's look at the lovely curator from the museum in Tynset weaving a pickup band. And so what do we see in this photo? She's threaded the lengthwise threads or warp through the holes and slots on a wooden band heddle. And I've included a drawing of one at upper right, so you can see what that looks like from her perspective. So she's threaded the warp alternately through the holes and slots. And in that way, by moving that heddle up or down, she can create two alternate spaces in the warp for the crosswise thread or weft to pass through. So in this picture, she's pushed the heddle down, she's created a space in the warp, she's got her left hand in that space. Her right hand is holding a little hank of the weft thread. Now she can pass the weft thread through that space to create one row of interlacement. But before she does that, she can reach down with her fingers and pick up some of the threads in the bottom layer, hold them with the top layer, creating little floats on the surface of the band. And those floats combine to form those beautiful motifs. So you can really see how pickup weaving is very much hand manipulated, and the patterns that form are very much an integral part of the weave structure. So let's look at the first of the two techniques. For this technique, the warp is threaded alternately light, dark, light, dark, light, dark throughout. So when it's woven plain without pickups, you get a pattern of alternating dark and light horizontal bars that we see in the band, in the background of the band at right. Now in that band at right, you can see how the weaver has picked up alternate groups of the light-colored threads to form that kind of S-shaped motif. And then above that, she's picked up alternate groups of the dark threads to form a rectangular motif. But in the band at left, which is the more usual appearance that we'll be seeing of this technique, the entire surface of the band is covered in floats. So the crisscross motif is formed with the red and black floats, and the area around the motif is filled in with pickups. Alternate groups of the light threads have been picked up to fill in that background area. The entire surface is covered with floats in both colors. And on the back of the band, you can see the band at left where it curls around at the top. The back of the band has that mottled appearance where those horizontal bars have been broken up wherever pickups have occurred and has that characteristic mottled appearance. So in the next technique, this band has borders. The borders in black, white, and yellow are woven in the same technique we just looked at. But the center section is in the second pickup technique. And here there's a different threading. There's 2 white threads between the red threads. So it's red, white, red, and so forth. When this technique is woven plain without pickups, we get this pattern that you see right above the fringe of alternating flecks, almost a brick repeat pattern. The red threads for this technique are much thicker than the white threads, and only the red threads are picked up. The white threads are never picked up. Sometimes the red threads are also suppressed or dropped or pushed down to create that white background area in and around the motifs. And because the red threads are so much thicker and because of the threading, the motifs take on a raised or embossed appearance. And on the back of the band, which you can see where it curves around at the left, is a complete reversal. Where there was a red motif on the front, there's a white background area on the back, and vice versa. So now let's look at the 2 techniques side by side. On the left, we have the first technique we looked at, and this is sometimes called ripspluk or rep pickup on a rep threading. Here, the entire surface of the band is covered in floats in both red and white. And on the back that you can see a little bit of, it has that mottled appearance. The second technique at right has the raised red motifs, the receding white background areas around it, and on the back, a complete reversal. And this is sometimes called plukebond or plukeband. There's several different spellings of that word, means pickup band. So now let's go back and let's look again. The next image is that band we saw from Vesterheim, a little bit closer up. So you can really see the embossed effect that those red motifs in the center have. You can really see how the background recedes around the motifs. And in the borders, you might notice that the floats in white in the borders have kind of a thready appearance, and that we sometimes see when the 2 techniques are combined in the same band because the white threads are just so much thicker than the red and green threads in the border. So that's typical. So now let's look at the other Norwegian band weaving techniques that are not pickup, that we're not going to be looking at today, so you can tell the difference. So this is finger weaving. It's kind of a braiding technique. It's often used for stocking bands. And if you look at the surface, it's flat with no floats. The back and the front look the same. And the pattern is characterized by these, the colors forming these chevron shapes. And the next technique is card weaving or tablet weaving. This technique is used for the wide sashes in the Øst-Telemark costumes. And again, the surface is flat with no floats, and the back and the front look the same. And here the colors form little V shapes that look like knitted stitches. So you can see how different these techniques look from the pickup weaves that we looked at. And the next technique is kilim tapestry. This is the technique that's done on the cradle loom. If you've seen the cradle loom at Vesterheim, it is a type of weft-faced tapestry. The surface is flat with no floats. The back and the front look the same, and the patterns are characterized by these stair-step geometric motifs. This weave can be used for suspenders, as you see here, or swaddling bands, or sometimes the trim on the bottom of the woman's skirt. Now, the next image is of a Samisk pickup band. If we, the Sami people of northern Norway have a rich tradition of pickup weaving, and this is a Samisk pickup band. Their customs are very different, and they were outside the scope of my book, so we won't be talking about them here, but there is a rich tradition of pickup weaving among the Sami. So, all right, let's go back in time. I think I need to get a drink of water here. So this photo was taken in 1886. And this is a time when the majority of Norwegians still lived on farms and in rural areas, about 75% at this point. And it was in these rural areas that pickup weaving survived and thrived throughout the 1800s. And one of the ways that pickup bands were used in this old farm society was for costume bands. So let's look at a painting that was done in 1822 of a wedding party from an area in Hardanger. And we can see several instances in this painting where the artist might have been depicting pickup bands. So these people are wearing their festive church-going clothes. The bride, of course, has been further adorned for the ceremony. The young girl that we see to the left of the bride has her hair wrapped with a narrow woven band and coiled on top of her head in the style of unmarried girls. And that band might have been pickup woven. Her apron band that we see hanging down over her apron might have been pickup woven. And the same holds true of the apron bands of the bride and the married woman that we see at right, and also the belt of the tiny girl. Those all might have been pickup woven. The man's stocking bands might have been finger woven, but they might have been pickup woven. So it was, folk costumes like this varied from region to region, of course, and from valley to valley. And so I'd like to look next at a costume from Telemark from Vesterheim's collection, and this is from the 1800s. And you can see how very different this style of dress looks from the one we just saw. Here, the apron band is tied high around the body. It has these tasseled ends tucked under that wide tablet woven sash. And at right, we see that same apron band that's now been coiled up, but we also see a circlet that's been made with the hairband that belongs to this costume. And here the hairband has just been wrapped around and around and around a hank of hair or flax or other fiber to make a headpiece that can be worn, for example, by a woman with short hair, instead of wrapping the actual long hair with the band. And the ends of the band would hang down and back like streamers. So this is a folk costume, traditional dress from the 1800s, and it was on these traditional folk costumes that today's bunader have been based. Bunader are the costumes worn by modern Norwegians for festive occasions. And since many of the bunader incorporate pickup bands as part of the costume. Those pickup techniques have been preserved in another way up to the present day. So let's look at some of the bunader. This one is a bodice from Sunnfjord, and the museum record indicates that it was trimmed with an old swaddling band. And if you look at the pattern in this band, it is the same as the one we saw when we looked at the two pickup techniques side by side. That swaddling band had the same pattern as this one. But here it's been used as trim to trim and decorate and reinforce the edges and the back. And so that this is one part of the bunad from this area. And the next image shows a bunad from Vestfold that also uses a pickup band as trim around the neck and armholes of the bodice, trim around the bottom of the skirt, and as a belt fastened with a silver clasp. And next we see a bunad from Sirdal in Vest-Agder. Here we have pickup bands used as suspenders and a belt and belt hangings. And then next we have an image from Vesterheim of part of the bunad from Vest-Agder. This is the bunad that our language teacher had, and she was from Kristiansand. So what we're seeing here is the embroidered apron and the pickup woven suspenders have been buttoned to the underlying skirt. And that's what we're seeing here. This is the way the costume came to Vesterheim, but typically the predominantly red side of the suspenders would be used as the right side. And then we'll see some bunader from Vest-Telemark that use these narrow apron bands, two different versions here. And then in the next photo, we have a bunad from Vest-Telemark from Vesterheim's collection, where we can see a little closer up the apron band on the embroidered apron at left, and you can see both sides of the band there. And then at right, we see a hair circlet that's been made from the hairband that goes with this costume. And this one is made a little differently. It's wrapped in the same way that the girl's hair would have been wrapped. There are two hanks of fiber, and the band is taken around in a figure-8 fashion, wrapped around in the two sections in a figure-8 fashion, with the hair showing through between the rounds. And that's the way the girl's hair would be put up with the band, and that's been duplicated in this circlet. And then there's another type of headdress from Hallingdal that also uses a pickup band. This band is wrapped more closely around the two sections of hair, so you don't see the hair in between, and it's put in more of a horseshoe shape rather than a circlet. And this is the headdress for unmarried women in Hallingdal. And so what about for men's costumes? I have two images. This one is suspenders from Nordfjord. They're very finely woven, and the museum record indicates that they were likely for a bridegroom. I was so taken with the pattern in these, which you can't really see close up, but I was so taken with the pattern that I charted it from the photo and wove a sample that I put on my website at norwegianpickupbandweaving.com for those who might be interested. And next we have some suspenders from Nord-Østerdalen. You can see how the suspenders would have been fastened to buttons on the trousers, both front and back, and there's a slide to adjust the length. Okay, so Next, we're going to talk about coat bands. And the man at right is wearing a coat band. This particular one appears to be knitted, but pickup bands were often used for this purpose. In the old days, the coach drivers often wore big fur coats, sometimes made of wolf pelts to keep warm. These coats had no buttons or other means of fastening, so they used bands, long bands that were about 4 meters long to hold the coat closed. And here you can see how he's brought it around his neck under the collar. He's twisted the two halves together over his chest for a short distance, then separated the two halves. They go to the back, crossed and back, brought to the front where they're tied. And this would hold the coat very firmly closed. And there is also an alternate method of tying the coat band, which we'll see next. This photo is for comic relief. I drafted the services of this small rodent to demonstrate how sometimes the coat band was simply crossed over the chest rather than being twisted around, the two halves twisted around over the chest. So that's our comic relief. Next, we're going to talk about swaddling. And pickup bands were used to swaddle babies. This image is an epitaph from 1601 in Vestfold. And we don't know whether this is depicting a pickup band or not, but we do know that pickup bands were used for this crisscross method of swaddling in many areas. And the next image shows another method of swaddling, this one a little more modern because the arms are being left free here. This is from Setesdal. You can see how the band is wrapped around the legs down below, then around the torso and crossed over the chest. And this just holds the swaddling, the rags that are packed around the baby and the outer cloth that just holds everything in place. Now, in the book, I talk a lot about the different methods of swaddling, the reasons for swaddling, many of the beliefs that were associated with swaddling. And we won't go into that here, but I would like to show you 3 special swaddling bands. The first one is a christening band, which is what swaddling bands were called when they were used for the christening ceremony. This one is from the 1700s, and it's very interesting because it has a silver coin sewed into the end of the band. Metal was seen as having protective powers, and the old folk beliefs did live on for hundreds of years side by side with Christian traditions. And this is one example of that, metal being viewed as protective. The infants, of course, were vulnerable, seen as especially vulnerable before christening. And so this was one means of protecting the baby, to sew that coin into the end of the christening band. And the next band is from Norfjord, and it has basically the same pattern as those suspenders that I told you I charted. And what I wanted to point out about this one is if you look at the bottom, right above the fabric binding that you see at the end of the band, you can see how this rip threading is offset and shifts from, because those 2 rows right above the binding are woven plain without pickups. So you can see how the threading shifts from red, white to white, red. It shifts 8 times across the width of the band, and that's what allows this little more complex pattern that you see with the nested zigzags along the edges, for example. But on the back of the band, it still has that characteristic mottled look. So that's a beautiful swaddling band. And the next image is of a different kind of band that's used in connection with swaddling. And this is a bløyeband. There are a number of them that have survived from Noor-Oosterdalen, and we'll look at a couple more from Vesterheim's collection later. But this band was used to hold an outer covering in place. So, for example, it might be used to hold if a swaddled baby was wrapped in another blanket to keep it warm. This band could be tied around to hold the blanket in place. And for the christening ceremony, the swaddled baby might be wrapped in a fine white linen cloth, and then this lovely red band tied around to hold that white cloth in place. So that is another type of band used in connection with babies. And here's another way that we don't know that this was a pickup band, but this is another way that a pickup band might have been used to hold a swaddled baby around the woman's body as she worked. And next we'll see what's called a sending band. This one is a pickup band. We can see that from the photo, and we even see some woven in initials there at one point along the top. So this woman is holding an ambar, or wooden porridge container, and she might be carrying a gift of food to a neighbor's wedding celebration or to a neighbor who has just given birth. And she's wrapped this beautiful band around the container to help fasten it in place, and also to decorate it, and also to mark it out as her offering. So I think that's a beautiful custom. And next we'll see what's called a bed band, and we'll look at another one of these from Vesterheim's collection a little bit later. But this one is just hanging over a fence post, but it's designed to be hung from the ceiling or above some support above the bed to help older folks get in and out of bed. And you can see that triangular shaped handle at the bottom for that purpose. And then the next image shows how sometimes pickup bands were sewn together to make wider textiles. This is a beautiful blanket. It doesn't look like it was ever used. It was made from pickup bands sewn together. And around the edge, it's the band around the edge, the binding around the edge is in the ripspluke or rep pickup. And this again has the offset threading where the rep threading changes a couple of times across the width of the band, allowing the weaver to get that lovely lattice pattern. And I do have the warp draft and chart for that is one of the ones in my book. So let's look at a close-up of that band where you can see a little bit better how the bands were just butted together and sewn together with linen thread. And then she's edged them around with the second band. And the next image is of a textile made from sewing pickup bands together. It was very worn and used. And it's possible, in looking at this, it seems possible to me that this coverlet was made out of repurposed bands. For example, a long swaddling band that was worn and could be cut in half and repurposed by putting the two halves into the coverlet, or a set of suspenders that was maybe worn and putting the two halves in the coverlet. And I say this because if you look at one half of the coverlet and the other half of the coverlet, you sometimes see some matching bands, which leads me to believe they might have been repurposed. For example, a pair of suspenders. Okay, so let's look at a couple of bands from Vesterheim's collection. And the first two that we're going to look at were woven by this woman, Barbara Ramset. She and her husband, Paul, emigrated from from Tinset in Nord-Østerdalen in 1888, when Barbro was already 50 years old and the couple had 5 children. In the photo at right, they're in their 70s, so this is some 25 years after they emigrated. But she brought with her 2 very special bands, and the first one is a bed band. If we look carefully, if you kind of have to look sideways, but on the left-hand side above the triangular handle of the bed band, we see the woven in initials, PRBID, and this would have stood for Pol Ramset and Barbro Iversdatter, which was her maiden name. So this might have been woven during the couple's engagement, for example. But the bed band is constructed out of a very long pickup band. It's folded in half with the fold at the top. And then the 2 halves are sewn together or attached at various places with those interesting horseshoe-shaped tassels also attached. And then at the bottom, the 2 halves diverge and are attached to, what might have been a piece of broomstick or something similar that was covered with pickup bands to form the handle. So that's Barbro's bed band. And the next image is of a swaddling band that she brought with her. And this is in the wrap pickup technique. It's possible that this swaddling band could have been used to swaddle Barbro's 5 children when they were babies, because at the time her babies were being born in Nord-Østerdalen, swaddling was still being practiced, so that's possible. Okay, the next band that we're going to look at came to this country with this young woman and presumably was woven by her, but we don't know. Here she's 23 years old. It's 1854. She and her husband have just gotten married, and they are getting ready to emigrate to the United States from Nord-Østerdalen. And one of the bands she brought with her was what's believed to be a bløyebånd that we'll see next. This is an interesting example because the pattern changes so many times along the length of the band. And it's very well executed in that the weaver has transitioned very nicely between the different patterns, showing the technical skill of the weaver. It might not be evident from the picture, but this band is only 5/8 of an inch wide, and it's very finely woven. And this is presumed to be a bløyebånd to hold that outer covering or outer white cloth in place for a christening, for example. Okay, so next we're going to talk about woven in initials and dates. And this is a really interesting topic because initials and dates aren't really easy to weave into a pickup band. The reason is that letters and numbers are irregular and they don't always fit seamlessly into the weave structure. Remember that the weaver isn't working with a blank slate here. She's working with a specific threading. She's creating these little floats that go together in a specific way. And so she really has to stop and think, how am I going to make these letters and numbers legible and still work within the confines of the weave structure? So we're going to look at 4 different examples of how this has been handled. Now, let's go back to the previous slide, if we could. I want to talk about this band first, but we'll look at 3 others later. Let's look at the initials KKD at upper right. Here, she's very cleverly not extended the legs on those Ks all the way out to the selvages, because if she had done, the Ks would have been too large For the D, she's used a triangular shape, which is very easy for her to produce in this pickup technique. So that's really well handled. And she struggled a little bit. If we look at upper left, she struggled a little bit with the date, 1787. Now, the weaver who wove this band was an exceptional weaver. We can tell that from the fineness and evenness of the weave, the number and complexity of the patterns, the way she transitioned between the patterns. We know she was an exceptional weaver, but she still struggled a little bit when it came to those numbers, which shows some of the challenges. Now, the sevens are backwards, where she also wove sevens backwards in another one of her bands. That might have just been the way she made her sevens. Now, my guess as a weaver is that she contemplated for the 8, trying to put 2 diamond shapes together, one on top of the other, and realized that if she did that, it would make the 8 too large. That's what I surmised might have happened. She ended up deciding to leave a space in the band and backstitch embroider it in later. So I think that's a really interesting example of how it can be a struggle. So the next 3 bands are in the other pickup technique. And this is a technique that really wants to make diagonals. And you can see those diagonals throughout the patterns in the whole length of the band. Diagonals are what this weave does really well. But the weaver can still make a horizontal bar if she stops and thinks about it. And this weaver has done that for her date, the 1 and the 7 in the date 1807. For the 8, she stacked 2 little diamonds, one on top of each other, and that works very well in this technique. Now for the 0, she's used a diamond as well, a little bit larger than the one she's used in the 8, but not so large as it goes out to the selvages, because if she had extended it out to the selvages, it would have been too big. And she's very cleverly handled that, because she's put those little dots in around the 0. And she's done that to keep the floats on the back of the band from becoming too long. Because wherever the red threads are missing from the front of the band, they're floating on the back. And if she hadn't put those little motifs in around the 0, the red threads would have been floating for a long distance on the back. That would have not only made them prone to snagging, but that diminishes the integrity and strength of the textile. So she's cleverly handled that. Now, in the next example, this one is dated 1878. This weaver has made the 8s in the same way as the previous weaver, with the 2 little diamonds stacked on top of each other. She's gotten a little fancier with the 1 and the 7 because she's put serifs on those. But again, she's very cleverly handled that white space between by the 7 by leaving that diagonal line of flex in to keep the floats from being too long around that 7. And I should point out that not only does the weaver have to work out how to render those letters and numbers, she has to work out the spacing between them, which can be quite irregular. So the next example is from Vesterheim's collection. And this is a really interesting example because this weaver, dated 1886, this weaver has really thought this through. She's really done a stellar job. On the 8s in the 1886, you can see how she's rounded off those points on the little diamonds that she's used to create the 8s. She's rounded off those points, and she's done the same thing on the 6 and some of the letters and the initials. And that shows a lot of thought. I don't know whether they had access to graph paper in 1886, but if not, she's really slowed down and put a lot of thought in how she's going to render those letters and numbers and also space them. Now, you might be wondering what all those letters stand for, and we don't know who this weaver was. We don't know the exact names that these initials stand for, but it would have been the maiden name of a woman, ENDM, and probably her fiance's initials. So, why so many letters? Well, both men and women often appended the name of the farm where they worked or the farm that they were associated with to their initials. So I'm just going to pick some names out of the air. We don't know who this weaver was. We don't know what these initials stand for. But for example, if her name was Elisa and her father's name was Nils, this might have stood for Elisa Nilsdatter of the Moen farm. If his name was Anders and his father's name was Ula, might be Anders Olason of the Utby farm. And so that's how very often, at least in this district, they would render their names. So I think this is a beautiful little example. And again, this is believed to be a bløjeband, or outer swaddling band from Nordstrandalen. Okay, so we're not going to go into carving on heddles. The Vesterheim does have a number of beautifully carved heddles, and those were often used as courting gifts. And I do talk about that in the book. We won't go into that here, but I just wanted to show one lovely example of how initials and dates also were used in this way, carved into a heddle, the woman's initials on the left, and on the other side of the heddle was the date 1790. Okay, so my book was published in 2014. And since that date, there have been 3 beautiful regional studies published in Norway. This is one. All of these regional studies, they're beautiful books. They've cataloged a number of historical bands and included lots of charts and lots of information. The text is in Norwegian, but I did want to mention them. This one is Vovna Skatter from Only in Aust-Agder. The next 2, one is from Telemark, and one is from Vestland. And as I said, they're all wonderful books that the text is in Norwegian, but there are lots of photos and charts. So my book is still in print. The Vesterheim store carries both of my books. My Norwegian pickup bandweaving book has a lot more background and details on history and tradition than we've been able to cover here. It looks more closely at a lot of the Vesterheim bands, what we can learn about bands from the Vesterheim collection, and also has a how-to section, how to weave both techniques on the band heddle with lots of charts. My second book was published in 2024, Pickup Bandweaving Designs, and this contains 288 charts of my own, which shows how a weaver can build on traditional motifs and make endless variations. It also has a section on arranging color in pickup bands, and the bands that I weave have a lot more color variation than those you'll see in traditional Norwegian bands. And then I have a third book that will be available. I don't have a slide for that. It will be available in June of 2026 from Schiffercraft, as my other books also came from Schiffer. And it will be titled Bandweaver's Project Book, and it will be full of items that you can make with narrow woven bands of any kind. So lots of ideas and finishing techniques. So that's all I have for you today. I've enjoyed putting this presentation together, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was just a treat to listen to.
Oh, thank you.
All right, everyone, we are going to start the Q&A section of our presentation today. Again, if you have that question, you can enter it into the bottom bar, says Q&A, and we'll answer from there. I know a few people have already submitted questions, so we'll go ahead and get to those. Are the complex patterns and red colors considered protections against evil or mischief? There seems to be some tradition of that in Estonia as well.
Okay. So I did find in the research that Inger-Lisa Christie of the Norse Folk Museum did extensive research on swaddling and christening bands, and the diagonal cross motif in pickup bands was seen as a protective symbol in christening and swaddling bands. And my book also has some other reference to other things like the metal and the way the swaddling bands were wrapped and so forth, that also speaks to that protective symbolism.
Fascinating.
And the red color, yes, the red color was seen as a strong protective color as well, as pertains to swaddling and christening bands.
The viewers today are really enjoying the woven in initials and dates. And so we have a question about charts for picking up designs on bands from the 21st century, that it might be hard to do the twos, but wondering about charts for letters and numbers for band weavers.
Oh gosh, that's a good idea for me for future to work that out. I'm sure that many weavers have worked out those charts on their own. It does take some thought. And the one interesting thing about the woven in initials and dates that I think is really neat is that they aren't ever going to look as quote unquote perfect as the motifs in the band, the diagonal crosses in the band. And they have almost a hand-hewn appearance that I think is very charming, because they aren't perfect. So that's one aspect. You'll never get them perfect, is what I'm trying to say, but that is very charming.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There is a question about you classify the bands into type 1 and type 2 style weavings.
Yeah.
Can you maybe go into a little bit more detail on what classifies something as type 1 versus type 2?
Okay. So yes, in my book, it's very confusing because pickup bands, there's no universal name for those two pickup techniques. And in Norway, you might have, for example, the rep pickup that we looked at in Nord-Østerdalen, it's called parband, but not in other areas. Sometimes both techniques are referred to as plukkebånd or plukkeband. So there's no universal name, even in Norway. And sometimes in Norway, you'll see in the museum, they'll refer to both of them as grindvev, bands woven on a bandhettel, no differentiation. Or you'll see them just classified according to their in-use, swaddling bands, suspenders, and so forth. So the names can be really confusing. And then there's all those dialects too. And so I struggled with that. And in the end, I just decided to follow the lead of the Swedish book Bond. And they classified them as type 1 and type 2. And I did that. And then I just put in a little sidebar about all the other names. But today, in today's world, we're among English-speaking weavers. That second technique, that the plukkeband, is often referred to as Baltic pickup. And so among English-speaking weavers, if you say Baltic pickup, that's going to be the one that's reversible with the raised motifs. I don't know. What was the question again? Did I answer the question or not? How did I? I guess that was why I classified them in the way that I did, and it can be confusing, but that it's one reason why it's so helpful to be able to visually identify the two techniques, because you won't always see them referred to in a consistent manner.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've had a couple questions about the fibers that are used for band weaving in Norway. Could you tell us more about what fibers are used, and also for the warp and weft, what fibers were used? Are they the same, different ones?
Okay. So in the oldest bands, there would be a linen for the light color, uh, a fine linen for the light color, and a hand-spun wool, usually 2-ply for the colored threads. And then as cotton became more available in the 1800s, that started to replace linen for the light color in many bands. And then as commercially spun wool became available, that replaced the hand spun in many of the bands. But basically, most Norwegian bands are a combination of linen and wool or cotton and wool. The weft is usually the same as the warp, or it might be a little finer version if a thick yarn was used, for example, for the rep pickup, they might choose a finer weft, but normally the weft would be one of the warp yarns.
Right. Thank you.
Just want to remind everyone that they can submit their questions using the Q&A function. That's going to be the easiest way to ask questions and get them answered. I know some people have asked in the chat. But we do have a few questions on what kind of heddles were used, what kind of weaving instruments were used besides hole and slot heddles.
Yeah, besides hole and slot heddles. Hole and slot heddles are very well suited to weaving narrow bands. They are not well suited to weaving wider bands. So in Telemark and Setesdal, for example, they had a kind of an upright loom that was could weave quite wide bands, and that was used in those areas. In eastern Norway, in Nord-Østerdalen, for example, remember that band we looked at with the coin sewed into the end, that very finely woven christening band. That band had a lot of warp ends. It was it could not have been woven on a band heddle, and it's surmised that it might have been woven on an upright, almost ankle type band loom that was known in that area, or it could have been woven on a floor loom. And you can weave pickup on any loom that creates those two sheds necessary for weaving plain weave, because it is a hand manipulated weave. But yeah, we don't know for sure how those christening bands in the 1700s were woven, but they could have been woven on some type of floor loom. So, yeah.
Could you review again what floats are in band weaving?
Yeah, so when the weaver picks up a warp thread from the bottom layer of the shed and holds it with the top, it creates a float where that particular color is floating over 3 rows of the weaving. On 2 of those rows, it would have been visible on the top anyway, but because of the over and under nature of weaving, it would have not been visible on that row between. So it floats over that row between. I wish I had a visual for that, but it floats over 3 rows in the weaving, and combining those little 3-row floats is what creates all those motifs. And so it's totally amazing how many motifs you can create with just, and that band from Vesterheim, where she did such a good job of rounding off her letters and numbers, that only has 7 red threads, 7 of the thick red threads, and the red threads are the only ones that are manipulated in that technique. She only had 7 to work with, and out of so she can only create so many little floats in there. So she did a stellar job. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Okay. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Great review. There are a few questions about people who maybe want to get started in band weaving. Would your book maybe talk about where they, what materials would be appropriate, whether cotton or wool, and what size they would use?
Yeah. My book does have instructions. Um, I do show in the beginning the easiest way to get started with pickup weaving is to start with plain weaving, where you're just learning to warp the heddle or the ankle loom or whatever you're weaving on, learning to warp it, learning to weave back and forth. You can create lots of beautiful patterns just by varying the colors in the warp with no pickups. And in fact, my third book that's coming out, all of the bands are in colorful plain weave. So a lot can be done with just plain weave. But my suggestion is to begin with something that's really easy to handle, like pearl cotton, for example, a 5-2 or 3-2 pearl cotton. Learn to warp your loom, play with plain weave, learn to manipulate the weft and beat and all of the skills that go with just basic weaving. Learn those first and really get those under your belt before you go to make the pickups, because once you start pickup weaving, and yes, my book does have instructions for both techniques and how to do it. Once you get started with that, you are going to be very busy making the patterning. You're not going to have as much time to, you want to have those basic skills under your belt when you start the pickup. So that is my advice to get started. But yeah, my book does have instructions. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
There are lots of compliments in the chats, Heather, and lots of questions. I don't know if we'll get to all of them today, but another question for you is the difference between the two kinds of christening bands. You mentioned that there was one type that was maybe to keep the swaddling claws on the baby, and then one that was outer for some additional wrapping. Could you just briefly comment on the length of those, the difference or other differences?
Right. The length of a swaddling band really depends on the method, and there were about 5 different methods of wrapping the band, for example. It also depends on the width of the band. So the length of a swaddling band could really vary. I think Barbru's swaddling band is 90 inches long. Many of them were much longer. But if I could just hold this up, this is showing a swaddled baby, and you can see that's wrapped around, hold the swaddling clothes in place. That is how that ornate christening band would have been wrapped around the baby, whereas the Bløyebånd, then a white cloth would be wrapped around the swaddled baby. So underneath that, there's a swaddled baby. And then the Bløyebånd is holding that white cloth in place, if that makes sense.
Fascinating traditions. Thank you.
Kind of on the same vein as that question, do you know if pickup bands are still being used in Norway outside of the bunad and folk drakt?
I don't know. I imagine that there are weavers who are weaving pickup bands and using them in different ways. But I think it's mainly in the bunader that the tradition has kind of lived on. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think we have time for maybe just 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Okay.
Well, we enjoyed having you here in Decorah some years ago, Heather, and so some of our viewers are wondering if you would consider coming to Decorah again in the future.
I would love to. I love Decorah. I love the museum. If I could take a rain check on that, I'm not able to travel right now. But yeah, maybe in the future.
Good. And since you're not able to travel right now, we're so glad to have you here online.
Yeah, it's been great. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.